hazing and brutality in basic training does not lead to greater lethality. It leads you to having an army like the Russians did. Welcome to a special episode of Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. I'm Eric Edelman. I'm a contributor to the Bulwark and a non-resident fellow at the Miller Center. I'm joined in my partnership in all things strategery by Eliot Cohen, Professor Emeritus of Strategy at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and contributing writer to The Atlantic. Eliot, you and I are both preparing to atone for our sins, but today, normally we start Shield of the Republic with some jackassery. Yesterday when I was taping the forthcoming episode with Tim Bouverie, we talked a little bit about what had transpired just a few minutes earlier at Quantico, where the President and the Secretary of Defense were meeting with all the general and flag officers in the first, as far as I know, all hands meeting of the General Officer Corps. You've written about it, The Atlantic. You literally have written the book on civil-military relations, or at least the most recent book, the other one having been written by Sam Huntington, some 60, 70 years ago. What did you make of it?
Well, it's all out there in my Atlantic piece. For my sins, I was enjoying myself going to the Antietam battlefield to get ready to take a group of people there. So when I came back, I sat down and forced myself to watch the whole thing, 2.5 hours, which was excruciating. What I made of it was probably a little bit less. I was a little bit less anxious at the end of it than a lot of other people were in the following senses. I mean, it was appalling. Trump came across as a sort of a senile, doddering, malicious, incoherent, but possibly dangerous old man. Hegseth really came across, and I used this word in the article, as a lout and as a punk. He is kind of strutting around that stage, lecturing people about, not just about physical fitness and haircuts, but, about what it takes to lead and so on. So this is a guy who's been Secretary of Defense for 8 months. He had a few years in the Army, not a particularly distinguished career. He leaves as a major in the National Guard. Interestingly, an infantry officer who never graduated Ranger School, which is very unusual for infantry officers. I don't believe he even had jump wings, which is really unusual. And then, in fact, some of the things he was doing were really in civil affairs and so on. And he's hectoring them and bullying them and threatening them. And he is seeing the world from the point of view of a resentful company grade officer who, the basic theme of my article was, guys like him sort of daydream about being able to get all the generals to stand to attention when I walk in the room and I'm going to set them straight and I'm going to threaten to fire them. I mean, it was actually kind of the cry of I think a very weak and insecure man. Both of them completely incompetent, which is very dangerous, of course, and very alarming. The positive note, which I talked about, is the general officers behaved pretty much perfectly. They did not applaud until the very end, which was, the courteous thing to do. They did not laugh at the stupid jokes. They kept their poker faces. I speculate on what was going through their heads, most of which was probably not all that complimentary towards either the secretary or the president, but they behaved with perfect decorum and they did exactly what they're supposed to do. And it's one of the reasons why I feel a bit more confident that there were something like 25,000 years of military experience in that hall, if you think about it. And I don't think that they will, on the turn on a dime and, establish a dictatorship in the United States of America. Far from it. But it was really dismal. No question about it. What was your take?
So let me make 2 points, and then I'm anxious for your reaction. So one, you in your Atlantic piece make a extremely important point, which is throughout his speech, Secretary Hegseth talks about we must be lethal and we're different from everybody else because we're in the profession of arms. We. And our stupid, feckless, reckless civilian politicians and leaders have done this, that, and the other thing to the military, seemingly unaware of the fact that he's now one of those politicians and civilians who are, in charge of the, as he likes to call it, Department of War. Actually, I'm going to make three observations. I'll be interested in your response. So that seemed to me to be, very telling. That was a big tell that, he doesn't really understand even the role he has as Secretary of Defense. The second thing is it seemed to be a really huge contradiction at the heart of this. We have the best, the most lethal army in the world. Donald Trump rebuilt it. The president said, I rebuilt it. This was basically 2 years of 3% growth in the first 2 years of his first administration, which maybe arguably brought back a little bit of readiness that had declined. It certainly didn't rebuild the military. That's just, total and utter nonsense. But it's woke and sissified and, guys and dudes in dresses. And, so it can't be both. It seemed to me that there was a huge gaping kind of contradiction in the midst of all of this. And then there was something else, just as a matter of history, which I would really, appreciate your commentary on here. In the discussion where both he and the president talked about the importance of renaming the Department of Defense the Department of War. Well, first of all, they have not actually done that because that takes an act of Congress. The name is set in statute in the National Security Act of 1947 as amended. They would have to get the Congress to change that. So Department of War is really just, the kind of warrior ethos nickname that they've given the Department of Defense. But they make an argument that, since the Department of Defense was created, we've lost every war except the first Gulf War, and we did that because, Ronald Reagan, had the defense buildup of the 1990s. Now, I don't want to take anything away from, Ronald Reagan's defense buildup, which did, contribute to our victory in the Gulf War. But they seem to have missed out on a very important historical development, which was a group of professional military officers, particularly in the Army, who, in the wake of Vietnam and then in the wake of the 1973 war, understood the importance of precision-guided munitions and the important work of William Perry, later Secretary of Defense, but in the late 1970s, the Director of Defense Research and Engineering in the Pentagon as an undersecretary, who made major investment in precision-guided munitions and in stealth as a way of compensating for our conventional inferiority vis-a-vis the Soviets with high technology. And that it was, in fact, that plus the buildup of Reagan, which bought those weapons at scale, that enabled us to have the kind of victory we had in the Iraq War. Over, by the way, it was true, it was the fourth largest army in the world, but a not very impressive army in Iraq.
I was going to say, look, I spent several years studying the first Gulf War because I ran the Air Force's study of it. My conclusion is victory was overdetermined. As it turned out, we didn't know this at the time. We outnumbered the Iraqis probably 2-1. There's no comparison between even like the quality of our tanks or the sights on our tanks. You have the training revolution from the National Training Center. You had the end of the Cold War, which meant you could put as much of the United States military as you could cram into Saudi Arabia into the theater, plus the British when they still had an army, plus the French, plus, a whole bunch of others. So it was, plus the Iraqis were very stupidly deployed in a nice straight line. And I could go on and on. By the way, the other thing they miss about this Department of War stuff is the Department of War was the name of the Department of the Army.
Right.
They have a Department of War and a Department of the Navy.
Navy.
So, but look, these guys, first, they are historically profoundly ignorant. I mean, this of the many, there are many things that are deeply disturbing about them. The fact that both of them are genuine ignoramuses, particularly on military history, should be profoundly disturbing to, I think, to just about all of us. And you're right. I mean, I think, look, with Hegseth, I think this is a guy, as I say in the article, his personal history is that a number of family failures, his first marriages and so forth. His military career kind of cratered, but that was the thing he clings to. He ran 2 nonprofit organizations into the ground. He made his money as a journalist, which is of a kind. That's not a real journalist, but it's actually
a talking head.
A talking head, which is actually a profession that he despises, I think, if judging by what he says. So what he clings
By the way, you could tell that in the press conference that he had with General Kane for Operation Midnight Hammer, in the way that he treated Jennifer Griffin, a Fox News correspondent who's actually a serious journalist and a very good one.
So what he clings to is probably his experiences, not even as, I don't know whether he had a company command, it's probably as a platoon leader. And that's what gives meaning to his life. And I just have a feeling that this is a guy who is, profoundly insecure, deeply afraid that people are laughing at him, which is one of the reasons to laugh at him. And it causes him to act in ways which he has not a clue how counterproductive what he did was. I mean, I'll mention just one thing that may have seemed small to him, but I'm sure did not seem small to the generals. By name, he said, "We don't need any more Corellis." That's General Peter Corelli, who you and I both knew. General Frank McKenzie's, General Frank McKenzie, U.S. Marine Corps, who both of us know, the former CENTCOM commander, and General Mark Milley, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who was controversial, let us say. But these are 4 formidable 4-star generals who a lot of people in that audience knew them. I'm sure there are many who respected them, and even the ones who didn't know them or maybe didn't particularly like them would say, you don't trash 4-star generals in public. If you have to relieve them, you do it quietly. I mean, sort of the way Gates relieved Dave McKiernan.
Yeah.
You don't humiliate people. And he did that. The other thing actually that I found very disturbing with both him and Trump, there was a lot of racial dog whistles.
Oh God, yes.
So, for example, on the beard stuff, a lot of African American men have a skin condition which makes a close shave something that's really quite painful and
difficult, right?
And stuff like that. I forget the technical name of it. Trump was really, invoking racial stereotypes all the time. Hegseth had this self-restraint, not to mention firing C.Q. Brown, who was a very capable chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who's African American. But they were playing.
Although he didn't mention it by name, but he described his firings and tiptoed up to the both the racial and misogynistic parts of this by saying that he was firing them because they're people who had benefited from all this wokeness.
Right.
Which is, by the way, nonsense.
It's complete nonsense. It's complete nonsense. The question, look, I think the question for us, I mean, we no disagreement how awful this was. So what does all this mean? And in this respect, we may be in slightly different places. I think this is very bad. I think it may lead to some bad things. I'm profoundly reassured by how the generals behaved. And I continue to think that these guys are so incoherent, so incompetent, so muddled, so incapable of building teams and motivating people, that they will fail in a big way if they really try to, in some fundamental way, alter our system of government. Now, that doesn't mean that, people may not suffer as a result. In the same way, I think Robert F. Kennedy is going to have the deaths of children on his hands for having discouraged people from, doing some very basic vaccinations. But I don't think the science of vaccination will die in the United States as a result of Robert F. Kennedy. It will survive and it'll recover after he's gone. I think there's something similar here too. And then the second thing I think is, I mean, Trump, you and I have felt that Trump is crazy for a long time. This was the moment where I said he's not just crazy; he is old. This feels like the onset of senility in some way, and we both have seen this in people we've known, including family members. And I will not be surprised if he's incapacitated well before the end of this term. I really won't.
The senescence was certainly on display. He was slurring. He was, speaking in a monotone. Unlike you, I couldn't bring myself to watch all of it. I certainly watched a number of clips, but I did read the entire transcript, which was published, I think, by The Hill, of his remarks. And trying to follow the thread in the transcript is, it's not just, as some people said, meandering, and barely coherent. It really, made me think that people in the audience must have been, sitting there going, "Oh my God, what is, this is the commander in chief, So, there's that. I completely agree with you that the most reassuring element of all of this was the reaction, the totally appropriate and well done reaction of the officer corps. But I do think, and I agree with you that a lot of this was Trump, playing the greatest hits, as he did at Fort, renamed Fort Bragg. When he went down there and spoke to a bunch of enlisted personnel. I think he was hoping for the same kind of reaction, the same kind of rally, atmosphere.
Which shows how little he knows, by the way.
Yes, I agree. And again, I think the response was appropriate and, speaks well, frankly, of our general and flag officers, that they would not allow themselves to be sucked into that, which was a good thing. I do think, however, that, what the president did say about the military dealing with the enemy within, which is more dangerous even, he said, than the enemy without, because they don't wear uniforms. That perhaps we should use, as he would say, Democrat-governed cities as training ranges. All of this is continuing to normalize his notion that the military should be used at home for not just for law enforcement, which violates posse comitatus, as you and I have discussed on many occasions on this program, but also that it is meant to be a kind of Praetorian Guard, his personal tool. For evening things up with his adversaries. He went on and on at such great length about sleepy Joe Biden, the auto pen, how terrible he was. By the way, there's a segment in there where he talks about paper and wanting to sign, decrees on good paper, not bad paper, that goes on for a good, 4 or 5 minutes. It's just completely crazed. All of that, I think, is part of normalizing all of this with the public in a way that is worrisome and which bears, watching, I think. And I would add to that, and this is something we talked about a little bit in the green room, but we should talk about it for our listeners and viewers. Hegseth said that, he's sent out 10 directives on standards, physical fitness standards, grooming standards. We've talked about some of that. But also professional military education. I'll be very interested to see what they do with that. That could be very bad. But also on basic training. And basic training, he basically said, should be scary, should be rough. We're going to let drill instructors curse and, frighten people and toss their bunks and lay hands on them. Now, that's been against the rule since 1980. Someone said, this is not original to me, that, because, as you said, he was oozing insecurity and kind of grievance and wannabe toughness that, he wanted to be, Jack Nicholson in the movie, I think, was it A Few Good Men? He wants to call a code red, and haze some enlistees in basic training. You've made the point, and I take the point that, the military is just not going to, fall into that, at least, as a rule. But there will be exceptions. And I think there will be, terrible consequences for that. There will be some horrible incidents and perhaps lives lost. And that'll be on Hegseth. But I'd also just note that, I happen to have spent time in another country that had a military notorious for its hazing. Hazing and brutality in basic training does not lead to greater lethality. It leads you to having an army like the Russians do.
Yeah, absolutely right. And it tells you something about his style of leadership, which may be why he never really made it beyond major, which, you basically just have to have a pulse to get to that. And I also completely agree. These guys have no sense of constitutional limits or roles. I was struck. Sean Parnell, the spokesman, said Secretary's going to be talking to his generals. They're not his generals. There are generals. There's that. Having said all that, I guess I do tend to bet on the weight of the institutions. I mean, you're right. But that's basic training, like for the last 45 years. It means you've got several generations now of people who are used to training young Americans who know you don't need to do that. You don't have to do the kind of thing that was quite common, by the way, in World War II, where, if you had a lippy, a conscript, the sergeant would take him behind the bunk and beat him up. They know they don't have to do that. And that's not in a professional military where you're dealing with volunteers and you're motivating people. They know the drill sergeants are actually if you spend any time with them, they're a very smart bunch. They have to be. And they know that part of what they're trying to do is to get these young men and women, to first have confidence in themselves and, yes, to kind of accept discipline, but then they want to be emulated by them, and they usually are. I mean, that's how it usually works. They, and there's actually Tom Ricks wrote a very good book about basic training in the Marine Corps, where he kind of just followed a unit around, and basically what happens is they all want to imitate the DI. So I guess I have a lot of faith in the institutional resistance. I also really believe that as more of Hegseth's limitations for sure, but also the president's probably increasing incapacity become clear. And as it becomes clear that, look, he's not going to be around for another term, the political environment is going to change. And in some ways it's even changing. When Tucker Carlson and Ted Cruz both begin pushing back, when even Marjorie Taylor Greene in her own weird and dangerous way are pushing back, those are the initial signs, I think, of people beginning to think about a post-Trump era in which they don't want to have this hung around their neck. I also think, as a practical matter, if you actually try to use the military in American cities, certainly if they're confronted with like mass crowds that are peacefully demonstrating, you'll get disobedience. I really believe that. You're not going to get people sort of opening up with machine guns. I mean, I think the sociology of the American military is, it's not composed of loners and, drifters. It's actually quite different than that. And they're plugged into American society in some pretty important ways. And they won't want mom and dad to think that, what they do is they gun people down in the streets. I agree with you that, the way they behave is going to do a lot of damage. But this is part of a larger conversation which you and I need to have. I had breakfast today with a former State Department colleague, somebody who you know well, who was an ambassador to several different countries, a wonderful, thoughtful diplomat, and who's been out now for a number of years, but with whom I served in government. And we both kind of agreed with each other that America's place in the world just is never going to be the same. And I think, you're quite right that as they introduce an approach to national defense, which is focused on hemispheric defense, and that's going to be even worse. And it's, we're not going to go back to the world that you and I knew. And, but which means it's all the more important that we begin thinking about, well, what can we do with the wreckage that, these malefactors are going to leave us.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we're running a little short on time. I want to wrap up by asking you this. You make a very good point in the Atlantic article that as a matter of leadership, this was a terrible misstep by Hegseth, because one of the first things about being a good leader is making clear you have respect for your subordinates and you value their time. You don't want to waste their time. This was a colossal waste of time and money. I mean, hard to imagine these general officers and flag officers being rousted at 3:30 and 4 in the morning to board buses, to go to the auditorium, to wait for the secretary to show up at 8:30. I mean, it's appalling. But this was also clearly not just this was performative. This was sort of theater. I mean, one might say theater of cruelty. It was actually theater of dominance.
Oh yeah,
and clearly contrived for a public audience. Right? It was broadcast publicly, both speeches, and it was done behind this gigantic, American flag, in what was clearly a kind of homage to George C. Scott's opening scene in Patton, where he gives the famous speech about, the point of war is not to die for your country, it's to make the other guy die for his country, etc. How do you think that's being received, in sort of living rooms across the United States? I mean, it seems to me that, maybe I'm excessively optimistic, but I think most people are going to see this for what it is. This is like a pathetic wannabe,
I think anybody with military experience, there'll be some segment, in the enlisted ranks will go, good, more push-ups. But anybody who has military experience or has kids in the military or relatives in the military, and that's actually quite a few people, with a military of 1.3, 1.4 million people, I think are not going to like that. I don't think anybody can have watched the Trump part of the show. And let us remember, by the way, Trump wasn't aware that this was going to happen. This was all Hegseth's little brainchild. Can't come away saying, yeah, that's somebody I'm going to follow. I mean, even if you're hardcore MAGA. So I don't think this did them any good. And then, of course, on top of that, you have the government shutdown. So, and I do think, even though you're right, the audience was not supposed to be the generals were props. It undoubtedly had an effect on them. And I think what it's going to do is first thing is I think they're all going to go, okay, the Secretary of Defense is a punk. The president is senile. I'm going to put my head down and just do my job and try to get a job somewhere else. I'd rather be at some far-flung outpost. But to the extent they heard stuff they really found troubling, they'd say, all right, I'll go along with stuff that is strictly legal, but not more than that. So I think it actually, I think he prides himself on overcoming the deep state, and actually what they've just done is help congeal the deep state a little bit more. And it's, that's a common pattern in human affairs, isn't it? It's the idea of anti-fragility, that, you put pressure on it, it actually makes you less fragile.
Yeah, I should have done a hat tip to Nick Cottagio of the Dispatch, who called the whole thing, Patton for Dummies, which was, I think, an appropriate sobriquet for the entire misbegotten episode. At the very outset of this administration, you and I both predicted that this would be an administration that would provide some serious challenges for civil-military relations. We've already had several episodes. This is just one more. I guess I would say keep an eye on the ongoing kind of what appears to be. It's not a secret war. It's a war beneath the kind of threshold of much oversight in Venezuela.
Yep.
With dubious, legal and intelligence grounds.
I completely agree with that, but I will say, I think particularly people like us who really, let's face it, kind of loathe these guys, as we both do. We can also blind us to the things that are okay. So, Trump was boasting about creating the Space Force. You know what? That wasn't such a bad idea in my view.
No, I agree.
It was a good idea. I think, the idea of trying to cut through procurement red tape and working with, these rising companies like Palantir and Anduril and other, that's fine. Some of the stuff that Hegseth said about moving beyond a, zero defects kind of mentality, trying to get away from, unnecessary reports. Well, that's fine. Some of the stuff that, will crater when, if you're going to try to make everybody in the Space Force, be able to pass the Ranger PT test, then I assure you, you're not going to have anybody flying your satellites.
Or Cyber Command.
But there'll be some things that they will do, which will be okay. And I think the good news is behind the scenes, there are plenty of uniformed people and, what remains of the civil service who are going to try to steer this into something reasonably productive. And we, as that happens, we should recognize that and say, well, look, I wish we were, am I glad that we're making the Europeans pay for everything we ship to the Ukrainians? No. Am I glad that we're actually willing to ship a lot of stuff to the Ukrainians if somebody else pays for it? Yeah. And is that better than I would have expected from Donald Trump? Yeah. So, I think just, in the interest of intellectual honesty, we're going to keep an eye on that. But no, on the whole, this is terrible. And, you and I are about to go off and beat our chests for our own sins. We can give a thought to the sins of our leaders as well, although I doubt they're going to be beating their chests anytime soon.
Or repenting.
All
right. Well, I'll see you early next week. We've got, I think, a real treat in store for our listeners and viewers. I'm enjoying the book we're reading. It's terrific. And I'll see you then.
All right, everybody. We are sold out of tickets to all of our shows on the fall tour, except for October 8th in Washington, D.C. I was on a call yesterday planning out what we've got in store for you. It's going to be fun. Obviously, JVL will be there, so there'll be elements of darkness. We're also bringing in Sarah McBride for a conversation with Sarah Longwell that I'm super excited for. Maybe we might get Will Summer up to talk about some of the crazy shit that's happening on the MAGA right. I've got some other plans in store for you, so it's not too late. Get your tickets now. Washington, D.C., October 8th. You go to thebulwark.com/events, thebulwark.com/events. I hope to see you all there. It's at the Lincoln Theater. Awesome venue. Appreciate them for hosting us. And so I hope to see you all in Washington, October 8th.